Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us here this afternoon and this early evening. I'm Alan Weiner. I'm a senior lecturer here at Stanford Law School, where I'm the director of the program on international and comparative law. I also serve as the director of the Stanford Humanitarian Program and also the Stanford Center on International Conflict and Negotiation. It is my honor on behalf of Interim Dean Paul Brest, who is unable to be with us here today, to welcome you to this celebration of the awarding of the Jackson H. Ralston Prize in International Law. Before I proceed, though, I would like to stop for a moment and just express my thanks to some of the law school staff members I know who are here who have been working just so incredibly hard to help make this event happen. I'm thinking about Martha Ferguson, Monique Norquist-Chow, Maria O'Neill, Jody Carrion, Stephanie Ash, among others. And so thank you all for your effort to make our event go smoothly today. Well, maybe too soon to say whether it goes smoothly, so you'll be the judge of that, won't you? The Ralston Prize was created through the generosity of distinguished international lawyer Jackson Ralston and his wife Opal in the early 1970s. The prize is meant to recognize original and distinguished contributions to the development of the role of international relations. Indeed, we are honored this afternoon to have some of Jackson and Opal Ralston's extended family with us here today. I had a chance to meet a few of you, so welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's an honor to have you here. The terms of the Ralston Prize define the concept of law to broadly include all human efforts to enhance the establishment of international peace and justice, encompassing activity in arbitration, diplomacy, international organization, and other steps towards the peaceful settlement of disputes and conditions promoting world order. The Ralston Prize is awarded infrequently, and that means that the list of recipients is quite distinguished. Includes such luminaries as former US President Jimmy Carter, former US Secretary of State Warren Christopher, the former Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, Louise Arbour, Nobel Peace Prize laureate and human rights lawyer Shirin Ebadi, former US Senator George Mitchell, the former President of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, former Costa Rican President Oscar Arias Sanchez, among others. The first recipient of the Ralston Prize was Olof Palme, the former Prime Minister of Sweden in 1977. In celebration of the prize, the recipient, or as punishment for receiving the prize, the recipient is invited to give remarks honoring the occasion. And so it is my great pleasure to have the chance to introduce the 2024 winner of the Jackson H. Ralston Prize in International Law, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just say another couple of words because I like it here before I give the podium over to Zeid. His record of extraordinary international public service includes a distinguished career as a Jordanian diplomat, including service as Jordan's ambassador to the permanent representative to the United Nations, as well as Jordan's ambassador to the United States. He played a key role in the establishment of the International Criminal Court. Shortly after the ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, he was elected as the first president of the Assembly of States Parties to the Rome Statute and chaired some of the significant meetings and conferences that established the basic infrastructure for the work of the court, including the elements of offenses, which was a significant accomplishment that had to be achieved before the court could begin its work. In 2004, Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed him as his advisor on sexual exploitation and abuse, and the so-called 2005 Zeid report provided the first comprehensive strategy for the elimination of sexual exploitation and abuse in UN peacekeeping operations. His background before that, by the way, had included work in peacekeeping. He had served as a political affairs officer for UNPROFOR in the former Yugoslavia at the end of the civil war taking place in the former Yugoslavia. In 2014, he was named as the 6th United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, directing the leading UN entity in the field of human rights with a unique mandate to promote and protect all human rights for all people. He was the first Asian, Arab, or Muslim person to hold that post. Today, Zeid serves as the president and CEO of the International Peace Institute, which works to strengthen inclusive multilateralism around the world, including by helping governments, NGOs, and the private sector to cooperate in addressing existential challenges like climate change and pandemic preparedness. He is also the Perry House Professor of the Practice of Law and Human Rights at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey Law School. Zeid holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Johns Hopkins and a doctorate, a DPhil, a doctorate in philosophy from Cambridge University. And so I invite now to the podium the 2024 recipient of the Jackson H. Ralston Prize, who will deliver remarks on the theme of memory and moral consistency.
Thank you, Alan, for your warm welcome, and thank you, everyone, for making the time to be here. Just over a century ago, on the 20th of July, 1920 to be exact, in Damascus, Syria, at around dusk, a young man, together with a junior officer, drove his vehicle into a throng of people who had taken to the streets. People angered by their king's decision earlier in the day to surrender to an invading French army, a French army that had entered Syria from Lebanon. Even when a clash with the French spelt annihilation for the Syrian soldiers, the protesters viewed the king's capitulation as treason. And what began as a protest, mainly by the soldiers themselves, grew to become a small rebellion with exchanges of gunfire between the police and the rebels escalating throughout much of the day. A jail had also been seized and the prisoners released, and they too joined the uprising. The young man ordered the officer to stop the vehicle. He stood up, cocked his machine gun, and fired at the crowd. Pandemonium ensued, with people scattering in all directions. By midnight, calm returned to Damascus, and the rebellion had been put down. But 50 to 200 people lay dead in the streets, a horrific outcome to the day's events. Why should any of this matter just over 100 years later? Well, the young man wielding the machine gun was my grandfather and namesake, the brother of the king. And Alan, I know what you're thinking, and I looked into it, and it's too late to withdraw the prize. And if you're interested in the contemporary Arab world and Syria in particular, it is a piece of history that is of some importance, and I would encourage you to read Elizabeth Thompson's excellent book, starkly entitled How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, and not much ambiguity there. Now, I would like to believe my grandfather did not kill anyone, let alone unarmed civilians, that he fired over their heads, that he was only defending his brother and himself. An eyewitness even referred to it as a bold move, adding, had it not been for the personal risk my grandfather took, I quote, chaos would have engulfed the whole of Damascus, end quote. What amazes me is that no one in my family had ever known about this until very recently, that is, not even by way of whispers, which, given the bloodiness of the day, is surprising. Why, I ask myself, if he had gunned down people, at least some of whom would have likely been civilians, wasn't there a call at the time for his prosecution? He was about to be kicked out of the country, and certainly, had he shot unarmed people, he would have deserved it. Moreover, throughout his life and from most accounts, he was known to be a gentle, modest, kind man. Even more peculiar, when I, in my capacity as the UN Human Rights Chief, berated the Syrian government repeatedly and publicly between 2014 and 2018 for their callous actions against civilians, why didn't the government allude to my grandfather's action? What a delicious moment it would have been for the Syrian ambassador. Almost 40 years later, in July of 1958, my grandfather's entire family was seized by rebels, this time in Baghdad. No one had fired back, and the family was destroyed. One was even dismembered and his trunk dragged through the streets behind a car. My grandparents and father survived because they were not in Baghdad at the time, but they were made stateless overnight. How tempting it is then for me, in the light of this, to think that my grandfather's actions in 1920 were somehow justified. Again, a matter of self-defense. Would I not then be rationalizing, perhaps even desperately, a more comfortable outcome for myself? It is, after all, difficult for me or for anyone to cope with suffering brought on by the actions of an ancestor, let alone a recent one. If I were to discover my grandfather had not killed anyone that July in Damascus, his family in earlier periods did maintain slaves, am I ashamed of the fact? How could I not be ashamed? Should I feel guilty about it or made to feel guilty? As a matter of criminal law, guilt, as you all know, is not transferable generationally. It does not travel to those who are innocent of any wrongdoing, simply because of some family or generational connection. The children of a murderer are not themselves murderers, and all of us at an individual and personal level are not responsible for the sins of our forebears. That is not to say, however, we can just place a bulkhead between ourselves and whatever unpleasantries the past throws our way, or deny that at some emotional level at least, a connection with our ancestors still exists. To wash that away in a spray of amnesia is very foolish indeed. We must see our histories in high resolution, its warts most especially, understand them, know what harms our communities may have in the past caused others, and with much humility as a community, muster the strength to atone for them. Is that not what we are taught in our churches, temples, and mosques, in all our places of worship, to reach a state where our consciousness is both keen and sensitive to provide relief and remedy wherever we can, care for others, and pledge ourselves never to see hatreds arise again? All of us, if we go far back, or if we go back far enough in our family histories, will come across accomplishments, big or small, to admire, and most probably demons to recognize, however painful they are. Even if we try to lead good lives, our family trees will very likely contain in among the branches some shameful behavior. Humility should then flow easily from us, given the extent to which this residue of saints and sinners is spread across our DNA. Or, as that wonderful poet Hafiz of Shiraz warns us in his 10,000 Idiots, we should not wear our saintliness too easily. It is always a danger to aspirants on the path when they begin to believe and act as if the 10,000 idiots who so long ruled and lived inside have packed all their bags and skipped town or died. When looking at the global human rights picture today, it is almost impossible to disentangle the laws relating to rights from their historical context, or to ignore the failure of almost all countries to properly reckon with their pasts. I always thought how easy it would be for a Sudanese official representing Omar Hassan al-Bashir, when Bashir was still in power, to deflect the pressure being exerted on Sudan by European states shocked by Darfur. All they would have to say is, have you reflected your own country's complicity in the Holocaust in your national curriculum? And when glancing at right-wing populism very much alive in Europe today, can we not notice something peculiar? In Europe, from the 1960s and through the 1980s, right-wing political parties, like the National Fronts in the UK and then in France, campaigned vigorously against immigrants and immigration. But they remained largely confined to the edges of political life. It was the Austrian politician Jörg Haider who, starting in 1986, set the alarm bells really ringing. Haider was telegenic and cast a broad appeal, well beyond that of the die-hard xenophobes, through his sharp, well-articulated attacks on the freeloaders, the immigrant communities, or the migrant communities. 100 years after Karl Lueger, the populist mayor of Vienna, did the same against the Viennese Jewry, though perhaps with greater sophistication, because with the exception of those hoping to migrate or emigrate to Vienna, the Jewish community in the city did not suffer directly under him at the time. That horror came later. Isolate the grievance, pin the blame on a group, almost always innocent, while taking care to do it charismatically, and surprise, surprise, a political dividend emerges. When liberal conservative Wolfgang Schüssel invited Haider's party, the FPO, into a coalition government in 1999, it sent a shockwave through Europe. Within a year, European sanctions were imposed on Haider's party, although if other Europeans felt no desire to see themselves sucked into the traumas of the past, the measures they slapped on Haider were weak and certainly not strong enough to stem this new momentum. For all his charisma, however, Haider alone couldn't change the face of Europe. He was still too extreme in his views. For Europe to really go dangerous, someone else was needed. If you were a thinking right-wing European chauvinistic nationalist in the mid-1990s, what you hoped for was someone less like Jean-Marie Le Pen in France or Haider in Austria. What you wanted was a sort of celebrity, entertaining, flamboyant, and rich, and they did not have to be an extremist either. Not at all. All they had to do was lay waste to those other load-bearing pillars of governance, a basic sense of order, propriety, and decency, and that would be enough. Enter stage right, Silvio Berlusconi, a billionaire who offered a politics served with chaos. While for years another party, the Italian Radical Party, had specialized in being eclectic, it was Berlusconi's ownership of much of the popular media in Italy, control of the sort the Radical Party did not have, that elevated him above the rest. He flouted the rules and was revered for it in many quarters. Even before Schüssel in Austria, Berlusconi had invited back into the heart of Europe its old companion, hatred. He flung open the gate of government, first to the Northern League, a populist libertarian party in 1994, and then to the Brothers of Italy, Italy's current ruling party in 2008. By doing so, Berlusconi had guided shamelessness from the fringe to the center. And with the dismantling of memory, the memory of fascism in Italy in the 1920s and 30s, came the killing off of any corresponding sense of general alarm. and the inflammation spread to other countries and quickly. 3 politicians, Haider, Schussel, and Berlusconi, from 2 countries, both having helped shape European history in the early 20th century to disastrous effect, and both having not done enough since the end of World War II to confront their own histories in that regard. And it's not just them, of course, but almost all the countries of Europe are equally guilty of this. And look at Europe now, filled with the peddlers of hate. Geert Wilders will be the guiding hand or let's say the hand guiding the next government of the Netherlands. Giorgia Meloni, representing the Brothers of Italy, is running the government in Italy. And another arch-peddler, Viktor Orban, has long been running Hungary. And Robert Fico, who remains in serious condition in Slovakia after his attempted assassination, is the prime minister of that country. And in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats are the controlling party in the government of that country. In Finland, the right-wing populist Finns party is in the government, and in Spain, the Vox is gaining strength, and so too is the Front National in France. The extremists are here and at the center of power or closing in on it in many countries in Europe. There are some who will point out, yes, but they are not Nazis, as many of these politicians or parties are supportive of Israel or of Jews. And yes, that is true in many cases. The target may, and I use the word may very deliberately, be different this time round. And the focus is more on the African, Arab, largely Muslim immigrant populations. But the actual mechanism at work in the efficient production of hatred very closely resembles the Karl Weger method. Well, what about Germany, some will ask? Germany has long had a 4-year mandatory high school education on the Holocaust, and yet this has not prevented the AfD or the neo-Nazis from making continuous strides. Here, yes, one must recognize that Germany has done much better than most in facing its past. But I also urge you to watch the documentary by the brilliant young German director Eleanor Horn called The Lesson. She shows, and to my mind convincingly, the education long provided by successive German governments on the Holocaust is much weaker than most understand it to be. History out, shame out, madness in. The Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague has explored how best to stabilize the politically vulnerable narratives of many countries. The Institute's philosophy is elegant. Identify a divided narrative within a country, or 2 countries divided by a narrative, assemble a small group of historians from either side, have them agree on a contested period and a methodology, and have them attempt as best they can to stitch together a common narrative. Where there are divergences, create parallel narratives. For a while, I served on the advisory board for the Institute, and projects were launched relating to Kenya, Uganda, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Turkey, Armenia, Israel, Palestine, and there was even an exploratory discussion between Japan and China. Despite some promising early results, the Institute's work, unfortunately, never emerged from being boutique to becoming mainstream. The UN, in particular, has failed, or completely failed, to seize on the critical importance of working on contested histories, or is too terrified to do so. It still believes peace building in the wake of violence and conflict is best achieved by throwing cement at the problem. Rebuild the roads, the bridges, train security officials, police, and hope that reconciliation comes about by convening meetings. In January of 2014, 10 years ago, I presided over the UN Security Council, representing my country, Jordan, and early on proposed a debate on the role of memory in the search of permanent peace, or for permanent peace, using the first month of that year in which we would commemorate the centenary of World War I as a pivot for a public exchange. I also suggested that the historian Margaret Macmillan would lead off the Council's discussion. The Russians objected immediately. Vitaly Churkin, the Russian ambassador, asked to see me privately, and when we met, told me there would be no briefing by Macmillan or a council session specifically dedicated to World War I. What? I mean, I was stupefied. What's the matter with him? The war shaped almost everything that followed in the 20th century, including the UN itself. Did he want to avoid a modern-day and public examination of the role played by Sergei Sassanov, the foreign minister of Tsarist Russia, who, along with a handful of other individuals among the leading powers at the time, contributed to the start of World War I, therefore finding my suggestion still too tender, too fresh? He wouldn't say so, but it did appear to be the case. Having failed to convince him otherwise, in the end, council rules meant I had to yield on Macmillan, but a debate on memory was still held. And it was passionate. The only time I saw the two Koreas and China unite in complaining about Japan's attempts to sanitize its imperial history. A Japanese friend had remarked to me earlier, well, it's all well and good for them, the Chinese, to raise Nanjing 1937, 1938, but would they themselves ever openly discuss the crimes committed in the name of the Cultural Revolution? The commonly held view of history being an endless debate is also most unfortunate and frankly quite misplaced. No one disputes the broader sequence of events that have shaped humanity's past, and particularly its recent past. No one, with any credibility that is, would say that Franz Ferdinand was shot on the 29th of June, 1914, or that World War II began on the 2nd of September, 1939, both dates being wrong by a day. What historians will often contest are the motivations of the individual actors caught up in the unfolding sequence of events, or the precise sequence itself. Debates over details must not be viewed, however, as providing us with a justification to discredit history altogether, or for doubting or nullifying our understanding of historical flow. The discussion held in the UN that January in 2014 was never revisited. The UN, alas, is still content to work with what is more visible and more superficial. I did propose in 2014 the UN establish a historical service to assist states in decommissioning the more injurious of political falsehoods, but this was also ignored. For all this to change, the high-income countries most especially, and particularly the former colonial powers, ought to lead the world by example in sorting out their historical narratives. In almost every international meeting today, which brings us together, all governments, no matter what the overall issue, health, peace and security, finance, or development, equity emerges as the core demand from the developing world. And in every discussion, there is tension because of it, because of the fear on the part of the high-income countries that entertaining any details related thereto triggers a renewed pressure for reparations making amends for the past. In a meeting I was in recently on the future of peace and security, a European ambassador was telling his African counterparts that only by tackling the root causes of conflict could we ever hope to solve them properly. I agreed and asked if the root causes reached as far back as pre-independence, the colonial era, because I continued we would then be in the equity space. You would be surprised to learn there was no response. Yes, maybe not surprised. We must have a transparent window into the past if we're to offer ourselves any hope of a more certain, peaceful future. Unfortunately, the US is also trapping itself in restless, perhaps now uncoiling, historical narratives, with too many Americans apparently in deep disagreement over what is, after all, a common past. The tensions are ripening, and everyone should rightly be worried over where all of this will lead. The reactions to critical race theory over the past few years create an inescapable feeling of dread over the future of America and what happens next. It may well be the case that many Americans feel utterly alienated, economically abandoned, believing themselves to be the victims of a hardline, left-leaning, elitist America, and only because they are more religiously minded or conservative. It is a sentiment that is perfectly understandable. Questions of tolerance and intolerance are always more complicated than first meets the eye. Historically, however, it is unquestionably the case that individuals who were not people of color both designed and then presided over the enforcement of America's long-lasting structural discriminations, with much of it seemingly drifting down to us in the present day, still intact and lingering on, perhaps less as a matter of law than fact, in too many parts of the country. Yet this is a point that has been quickly brushed aside by many of those who remain wedded, mind you, to the idea that America emerged from one factory only, the Anglo-Saxon mind. And it is now those folks, the descendants of the founding fathers, who are being harmed, threatened existentially, their identity being flattened. That people of color, many of whom were slaves or were then slaves, and who by their toil and colossal suffering accounted for the extraordinary revenues wrought from cotton production in the first 60 years following independence, that they also built this country then and since then, is a reality being increasingly sanded over or resanded in state after state. Why? Because it has become to many a politician, a weapon wielded by the left that must be necessarily parried. But at what overall cost? To suppress by virtue of state law our full understanding of the evils of slavery and of its long-term consequences even to this day, does that not incur a cost? While there are many reasons to fear for America, this particular one, tampering with or stifling memory, sticks out as one of the most serious. I am not American, but my wife is from Texas, England and Texas, and her niece is with us here in the audience, and so are my children American. How does one change the condition which the US has now manufactured for itself? To leave it to an unstructured verbal or legal fistfight among politicians or among members of school boards or between social media pundits is, to my mind, too tenuous, too fraught with obvious danger. I would suggest, most humbly, that a National Historical Commission be created, a unique commission invested with the power to hold open hearings and propose amendments to the law. It ought to pick up where the Kerner Commission left off in 1968 and would, at the outset, focus exclusively on the African-American experience, which is sui generis, and later weave in the historic suffering of the other non-white communities in America, the First Nations, the Mexicans, the Chinese, and the Japanese. A settled and authoritative script must make itself available in a form where it would be accepted by most, if not all, Americans. One arrived at without the perception or political prejudice or bias that these perceptions had a role in its shaping. Owen Pell of the Auschwitz Institute advises, and I agree, that while a nationally recognized and widely admired figure should lead any future National Commission on History, its members ought to be the current or former archivists of the Library of Congress, the National Archives, the National Museum on African American History and Culture, the National Museum of the American Indian, and so on, so as not to be viewed as politically jaundiced. Once agreed to by the Commission, the newly arrived at national narrative supported by all but the most extreme political views would arm state and local officials and school boards with the right information on how to reflect history accurately in the educational curricula of the country. Without this reckoning, an internal reckoning, serious and immune from political distortion, any hope of drawing the narratives into one dissolves quickly. The first time I heard a compelling argument on this need for reckoning in general terms came from the New York Times columnist Roger Cohen 20 years ago when he was reflecting on the Bosnian War. Focus inward first, he said, then outside. There is now, even with all the tensions and the campaigning underway for the presidency, an opportunity for the US to still do this, to accomplish what most countries are unable to do, and begin to split memory and reconciliation from the acidity of contemporary political debate and build with it something new. Is it hard to do? It's virtually impossible, but not completely impossible. And no one ever said achieving moral consistency was easy. Confronting one's own record is, after all, what integrity is all about. Now, what about moral consistency along the horizontal plane, across individual country files, and in the present time? First, I would like to turn to our pain and the selfishness of it. My pain, my suffering, my self-pity. Is that not what we see across the Middle East now? In Israel, in many Arab countries, and recently on US campuses. If my people are threatened or attacked, I wail, where is the rest of the world? Why are you not with us? Why are you not standing by us, defending us? Would I also not be right to plead for it? Justified in doing so? Of course I would. Of course. And yet, could it not also be asked of me? Where were you when, in other times, in other places, when people suffered and wailed in the same way? Forgive me for saying this, but I did not see the people of the Middle East, Arab or Israeli, Christian, Muslim, or Jew, take to the streets in large numbers when the people of Yemen were in deep pain, or the people of Syria, the people of Tigray, the people, or let's say the Rohingya. And the story is as familiar as the list is tragically long. It is therefore about me, or us in the restricted sense. The pain is tribal, or we have tribalized it. Our grievance, our fear, and across the street of it, so to speak, our uniqueness, or in a language representing an adjacent, more negative feeling, our privileges, or our fear of losing them, are all too obvious, through and through. From this angle, the issue of double standards gushes out easily. Again, we see this being played out every day in the highly charged arguments over Gaza, with the US's almost blank check support of Israel and the comparisons drawn by many governments around the world, especially in Africa and the Arab world, with the US's denunciation of Russia's attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Now, of course, Russia attacked Ukraine, a sovereign state, and Israel was attacked by an extremist armed group, and the two are not the same. But what is also true is that civilians must be spared the ravages of bloodletting in both cases, else we surrender ourselves to the wickedness of absolute war. There's also nothing wrong, far from it, for students here or elsewhere defending in non-violent ways the families of the Israeli civilians attacked so brutally and criminally by Hamas on the 7th of October. Nor is there anything wrong for students to defend in non-violent ways the Palestinian victims of the appalling atrocities being authored by Israeli commanders on the civilian population of Gaza since the 7th of October, or defend the Palestinian civilians of the West Bank who since 1967 have been subject to the daily degradations of a military occupation now amounting to something like apartheid. It is individuals who cause avoidable death and injury, not peoples, not religions, and those individuals must be brought to account. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has sought the indictments of 5 individuals, 3 from Hamas and 2 from Israel, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the pretrial chamber will have to decide whether or not to confirm them. It is also worth stressing the point the ICC itself must also act consistently. Its performance over the first 20 years of its existence has been uneven. It's hard for us to square the fact that it has exercised jurisdiction over Afghanistan for well over a decade now, and there is still not a single indictment, when there are 4 already with respect to Russian leaders and 5 issued in relation to Gaza. How is that possible? That is not to say that Putin and possibly Netanyahu, pending a confirmation, must not themselves answer to the charges before the ICC. They certainly should. It is just that the court itself must stick rigidly to the narrow path that is consistency and not give the impression it can sway. More generally, Western governments are especially accused by other states of being quick to condemn the dictators and populists who are judged to be adversaries or enemies, and then excuse or be silent over those considered to be friends. And the critics are right, of course, but not totally. From my long experience with these matters, all states practice double standards, all of them. I saw it in Syria and Yemen. The states most vocal in their attacks on the conduct of the Syrian government were also some of the quietest when it came to the attacks inflicted on civilians in Yemen. When all states and organizations need to demonstrate, at least part of the time, some moral consistency and clarity, so too is accepting they need a strong referee. Take any professional sporting league and ask yourself, where does power reside? Well, quite obviously, when thought of in monetary terms or popular reach, it lies with the franchise owners and the star players. That's where it lies. But for the sport to exist in any professional sense, you need rules and you need referees and officials that enforce them. Otherwise, it'll become a sport akin to that played in the yard of a primary school. Yet the referees and the officials are not known at a popular level, nor are they highly paid. The franchise owner may drive home in a Bentley and the star player in a Lamborghini, while the officials return on the subway or a bus, but it is the latter who decide the points and award the penalties. On them, the game depends. The United Nations is the repository of the largest number of international treaties, including the core human rights treaties. These are the global rules, and the UN is, in effect, the custodian of them. The Secretary General, therefore, is by logical extension a sort of referee. If the referee is shy about blowing the whistle consistently when fouls occur, the game will eventually turn ugly. Similarly, if a specific Secretary General is appointed by a handful of players because those players know the former can be easily intimidated into not blowing the whistle when they themselves violate the rules, the effect is the same. Ultimately, the game is destroyed. In the context of international relations and the state of human rights, the situation is even more problematic because of the existence of the veto in the hands of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Now, imagine a game of football when 5 of the players on the field can overrule any decision made by an official. The game can still probably be played, sort of, but not indefinitely or with any sense of integrity. That is our world today. The US has used the veto 51 times since 1972. Many of the vetoes cast by the US, Russia, and China, which account for all of them now, with the UK and France hardly ever using them, occur when there are grounds for believing that atrocity crimes are being perpetrated. And if the Security Council is unable to respond, the agonies multiply and avoidable suffering continues. And the malaise now being felt globally just worsens. We need courage and memory, moral consistency and clarity, and much of each if we are ever to survive as a species. We need to celebrate those who show us the extent to which us human beings can achieve amazing feats. Help us shape our own will. And I'm not thinking here of the tech giants, but the moral giants. Gandhi and Martin Luther King revealed what is possible. Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Louis Xiaobo, Alexei Navalny also showed us. So too is Vladimir Kara-Murza, Leopoldo Lopez, and Masih Alinjad, and so many others. Human courage and kindness will always tower above all other human qualities when it comes to drawing us out of the shelters of fear and silence and make us do better. On the 12th of October, 1936, on a stage at the University of Salamanca, the rector of the university, Miguel de Unamuno, or de Unamuno, please forgive my pronunciation, did something quite remarkable, although this version has also been disputed. Scheduled to host a ceremony marking a Spanish festival, he walked up to a lectern in front of General Milan Astray, the nationalist commander and founder of the Foreign Legion, and standing before Franco's wife in a hall filled with the supporters of the nationalist cause, including the phalangists with their fascist salutes and their shouts of "Viva la muerte," he opened his account with destiny. By that stage in the Spanish Civil War, Unamuno was appalled by the violence brought on by both sides. Beginning with a soft tone, he uttered, "I am unable to stay silent." And then, placing his life in the most extreme danger, he went on to criticize Astray openly, noting how it pained Unamuno to think the latter would, and I quote, "dictate the pattern of mass psychology." "You will win," he conceded, "because you have more than enough brute force, but you will not convince. To persuade, you need what you lack, reason and right in your struggle." End quote. Astray began to shout, "Viva la muerte!" Bedlam set in, and Astray's bodyguard raised his machine gun and pointed it at Unamuno. Only the intervention of Franco's wife saved the rector. Interestingly, Unamuno was himself not a liberal. He identified more with a religious conservatism, but was willing to speak critically to his own, to the nationalists, at the risk of losing his life. Ultimately, only those leaders, communities, and countries willing to confront themselves, their own conduct, their own past, standing up for the rights of all human beings peacefully, will be viewed by the rest of us as being properly suited to shepherd humanity to a more just and peaceful experience. That invitation has always been there, and all are encouraged to accept it. I'm deeply, deeply honored to be receiving the Jackson H. Ralston Prize from the Stanford Law School and before his family, and to have presented this lecture to you, and I'm grateful for your patience and kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeid, for those remarks. There's a call for moral clarity and courage in your speech, and I think your remarks reflected that kind of clarity and moral courage on your own, and being clear and consistent without necessarily pandering to views that are popular at this moment, but reflecting on your own deep conviction. So thank you. We will have a chance to have some questions. We have Brian and Martha here who will have microphones if you'd like to ask a question. But, you know, as is always the case, the moderator avails himself, I think is the word we use, of the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question. And I was scratching my head and struggling a little bit when I was reflecting on your observations about atonement and the importance of communities dealing with their past sins. In some of the And I found that to be kind of very compelling in the context of a society looking at itself. But some of the work that I do, and I know you do as well, is focused on conflict resolution. And your remarks talk about discussions between divided states or between divided communities. And one of the concerns that I've often had is that it's true that we can't solve problems with just more concrete, but the work that needs to be done for communities that are divided, that are seeking to build a future, is to do just that, to begin to envision a mutually bearable future. And that trying to reach agreement on the past is perhaps a bridge too far. Is it better for states or communities that are divided, if they're trying to resolve their conflicts, to try to imagine a bearable future that will involve a tolerable place for both of them? Can they do that without addressing the past? Does addressing the past impede or make that project more difficult? It seemed to me that reaching agreement on that historical narrative would be a real challenge.
Well, this was the Lincoln sort of view of things. And that you, at the conclusion of the Civil War in April 1865, or I think March, the United States would look ahead and not prosecute those for having committed outrages. And it became the sort of norm for many decades that followed. But it hasn't worked. And we saw this in the former Yugoslavia. You served in the International Tribunal, and I was there. You only need one chauvinistic populist to begin to really churn up the material. And if it's not really properly settled, it becomes weaponized. And I think it's highly dangerous. The thing is, Alan, we're not even trying. We're not even trying. You know, why hasn't the UN had a debate in 10 years on this? You know, we know that historians write for historians, professional historians, by and large, write for professional historians. And most people will get their histories from high school, whatever they picked up in high school, maybe some college courses, and then often what they see then sent to them by their friends, some of it from social media. Much of it doesn't really work very well. And I think all of those who are academically minded and who are scholarly know that, I mean, when you go online, there's a very strange phenomenon. It's not new. It's always been there. That when you look up a post on an issue that you know really well, right? So you go to Wikipedia and you look up something, and there's almost an error in every line, right? If you know the issue. But if you don't know the issue and you look at a post, you tend to believe everything you see, right? Because you don't have the ability to draw by comparison, draw on a knowledge that's more well developed. And so I don't think we're even trying to do it. And you know, everyone's trying to, if you're running away from it, then you have to sort of deal with it at some stage. I mean, how can it be that within the lifetime of someone like my father, Europe is back in this state again. How can it possibly be within the lifetime of a human being that we're back in this? What does that say? And I picked on Europe. I mean, you could go to many countries and look at the same thing. But Europe is where World War II started. Europe is where World War I started. And what? Within 100+ years, we're back. I mean, it's amazing. So how can we still ignore it? So just let's make a start. And that would be, at least give us some confidence we can move in the right direction.
I'll ask one more question before I open it up to the audience. But your brilliant remarks talked about two different questions. One of these themes of history, but you also talked about the role of the ICC, with which you have obviously enormous experience. One of the arguments that defenders of transitional justice or criminal accountability make is that these kinds of tribunals do just exactly what you described. They produce a kind of a narrative, a battle-tested narrative that makes it more difficult for people to engage in historical revisionism. It's one of the claims, I think, that's often made about one of the lasting legacies of the Nuremberg Tribunal. On the other hand, the court is itself now, I think, being seen as or being made to be a political actor itself. And if we look at the response to the announcement that the prosecutor will be seeking approval for his indictments of, as you say, 2 Israeli leaders and 3 Hamas leaders, should the court try to think about the political context within which it works? Well, we certainly know that it shouldn't engage in political favoritism and say, I'm going to prosecute my enemies and acquit my friends. But when I look at what has happened, I thought there would be no greater bone that could have been given to Benjamin Netanyahu in terms of the domestic political situation in Israel than this indictment, because now everybody who had been opposed to him is feeling compelled to rally around him. Is that the kind of thing, I've talked about this with former prosecutors, Luis Moreno Ocampo, Richard Goldstone, who we've talked about, is that the kind of thing a prosecutor should think about? What will be the political impact of my work, or is it let justice be done though the heavens may fall?
Yeah, so 2 very important questions, and I wish we had more time. So let's start with your second point first. I would urge everyone to look at the report by the senior advisory panel that was appointed by the prosecutor to review the evidence. There was an article in The Economist today which sort of poo-poos to a certain extent the notion that the court can do exactly what you were saying. But the Economist, with all due respect, has not seen the evidence. And the people who are on this panel, I think we know all of them, and highly respected, and each one individually said, on the basis of Article 58 of the Rome Statute, and looking at the evidence, there were grounds or reasonable grounds to believe that the arrest warrants were merited. And of course, the judges will have to now decide. I don't think that they need to think about the political in the way that the Economist or even you may be suggesting. I think they have to do their job. But they need to remain clearly consistent. There is something called prosecutorial discretion. When you draw up a strategy, one understands that you might have to postpone some investigations because others merit a greater attention in a specific period. But I think, again, what worries me is over the longer arc, there's certain situations that haven't been dealt with, as we saw in Afghanistan, and that needs to be dealt with. The second point is I don't think, while I agree with you that cases, criminal cases adjudicated will unearth histories that must therefore be built on by other historians, sort of embroidered and built and expanded in terms of the details of the narrative. Criminal law cannot satisfy everything. And if you want to see how this works, if you look at the trials of the Allies, of the 7,000 to 8,000 Nazis at the close of the Second World War, most people think of Nuremberg, the main trial. You have the 12 subsequent trials, but then you had all the other trials. It seldom did you ever find that anyone convicted stepped onto the scaffold, and many were hanged, and expressed contrition. before being hung. I mean, hardly a single case. Even in the main trial, you had a few. Hans Frank, maybe. I mean, it's sort of, and then you had a sort of Rudolf Hoss of the commandant of Auschwitz, maybe. What is really telling is read the book by Gita Sereny, Into the Darkness. So she was a rather well-known journalist, and she interviews Franz Stangl, the former commandant of Treblinka, the second commandant and the first commandant of Sobibor. And throughout his trial in a West German court, he always held to superior orders. He said, I had to do my job, and then I had to, if I didn't, I would be sent to the Eastern Front, and so, which was complete nonsense, because already in the Ulm trial in 1958, it was shown that no one was punished for disobeying orders. So that whole defense was ridiculous. But he wouldn't get himself to admit that he murdered over 700, maybe to 1.1 million people. He just couldn't get himself to admit it. And Gita Sereny did something no court could do. She just remained silent. So she interviewed him 4 times, and you read this in the book. And the first interview, she asked him about his childhood, and he wept. And then she asked him in 2 other interviews, more recent episodes, during the war. And then in the final one, she hardly spoke. She just sat there and let him speak. There was long pauses, half an hour, then she'd say something, and then half an hour would pass. But she let him speak. And he reached the point where he recognized that he had committed profound evil. His body sagged. He couldn't say it, but she knew it. And the next day he died. And that's what you want a court to do. And if a court can't do it, historians have to try. And if historians can't do it, then journalists have to try. Just one final point on historians never agreeing. I think you're right when historians build up a reputation as a deconstructionist, a revisionist, a neo-revisionist. But my own experience when I was a neophyte historian, and a friend of mine basically also expressed this view, is that if you sit around a group of PhD students working on the same history, or let's say postdocs, no reputation, no money, no nothing, no positions, you're just students working on, we could often come to an agreement on the major sequences. We had nothing to defend. And if you put the material in front of everyone, and this really, it wasn't so much my view, it was my friend's view, and I agreed with him, we could come to an agreement. And that's what you need to do. And then you build on it and settle it. And you can have parallel lines where you disagree. Yeah. But to leave it as an open book, I think is a mistake.
You probably know the book. I've forgotten. It's a book written by a Palestinian, an Egyptian, and an Israeli. It's El Monem from Egypt, and I think Shikaki, and I can't remember.
Khalil,
yeah. And there's a passage in which they agree on certain things, and where they can't agree,
exactly.
They each have
it's in 1948.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
well, let's turn it over to you. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. I can assure you that if you don't have questions, I can ask more, but you probably want to hear from somebody else. The young man in the back with the tie.
Thanks so much for this wonderful lecture, very thought-provoking. I wanted to ask if you had examples of countries that have done successfully the kind of consensus building on history that you, I think, very convincingly urged the United States to do.
So there was an OECD study. This goes back about maybe 10, 12 years ago. And they said that a number of countries had done better than most. And I seem to remember Norway was one dealing with the Quisling experience and some of the worst crimes that occurred in occupied Europe had occurred in Norway. Together with France, Norway and France. And there was sort of a comment that they did really a bit better than most. And I seem to remember Romania for some reason also. And it's not just settling the main lines, but then reflecting the main lines in the national curriculum. Good, bad, and ugly, the whole lot, right? But very few seem able to do it. And the fact that we had this sort of raucous discussion in the Security Council, and then never gone back to it. Well, then that tells you something. That tells you we have to go back to it because we're missing a major part of it. We're missing a major part of this. And so we need to start to make an effort. And it's no good sort of pointing to others. I mean, every community has to begin with itself. But when you see in this country, critical race theory prescribed in state after state, forbidden, academics are forbidden to make a reference to it. I mean, it's so patently wrong that, and unhealthy. And to go in this direction is, I think, terribly dangerous. And my career began in a war, and so did yours. I mean, we began in the former Yugoslavia. It's extremely dangerous to go down that way. And so why even test the proposition by quashing, restraining, stifling discussion on it? Let the discussion emerge. And I think it's the right way to approach it. So to be honest, everyone almost gets a failing grade. Germany better than most. But for the countries that begin to do this properly, I think they can lead the way for others. And so instead of having a partisan political knuckle fight over it, it's done cleverly and properly. And you can have a group of young historians begin it, and then slowly sort of build upon it.
Other questions from the audience?
We have one over here, Alan.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Shafeen. I'm a third-year law student here. I really appreciated what you mentioned about building historical memory, and I think folks have touched upon kind of how to build that idea out. What I'm curious about, you mentioned the National Historical Committee, and what happens next after, we build these historical records and we identify crimes that have been committed against citizens of the state or other victims. I'm wondering what your theory is on accountability and how we kind of think about almost kind of restorative justice for these victims. Is there something more? Is it just building the history in itself is the accountability? And
you've raised an excellent point, and I'm glad you did this because, all too often, it's like we're so rushed. We jump from one thing to something else very quickly. So, you can't discuss equity when it comes to health because immediately means reparations, or immediately means, high asset transfers from the north to the south. But it shouldn't foreclose us having a discussion. We need to have a discussion. We need to sit and, you would be surprised in how many international fora, people raise equity and practically no one understands what it is, right? Because the automatic assumption is that it's a trigger for something else, and therefore we have to close it down. And so we need that discussion. And you don't know where it's going to lead. So I think the thing is just to start it and to talk about it. And then eventually states and school boards, of course now it's so difficult to think of how can you do this now. It's all sort of mad. Yes, but there's never really a good time to start. And you can start by having a few people propose and do an open letter, and then slowly the others may join. Some members of Congress in the middle who are terrified of where this is going may join. And suddenly you have a momentum toward doing it. If you don't do this, it just continues to become septic. So I think it requires a dedicated move. But thank you for asking the question. Thank you.
Zeid, you in your remarks, you noted that part of what was problematic about the response, the lack of moral consistency, is that so many of us see problems around the world in our own community from our own perspective. It's our own identity with victims, a sense of tribalism. Social psychologist who was part of the Conflict Resolution Center that I direct here, the late Lee Ross, once said that it's futile to try to persuade people of things that they can't afford to understand. So when we think about this kind of historical problem, if we are seeing current identity issues, current political issues, say current demands for equity in the international context, if we immediately hear these questions about resolving history as triggering contemporary political challenges, how do we overcome that? Is it just, what's the formula for persuading people that you can't afford to engage in discussion around this?
I mean, I hope that there are enough people who will look at countries that have become untethered in the past and try and understand why did they become so. During COVID, I mean, COVID was dangerous for many reasons. I mean, of course, the health aspect, but it meant that a lot of us would just frighten ourselves by reading histories. At least it happened to me. And I read Anthony Beevor's celebrated book on the Spanish Civil War. But just read the half of the book. And I mean, it's an amazing descent into violence. And you think, are there not parallels with what we see today? And at some stage, the brakes have to be applied. And if the brakes are not applied, then the end state is sort of well developed as a historical experience. You know that this is going to come. And surely there must be enough people to understand this. And at what stage is the brakes going to? I mean, you could see in the Spanish, in the prelude to the Spanish Civil War between 1931 and 1936, and especially after 1934, that the center basically collapsed in Spain, especially the liberal center in Madrid. And then it became madness, and it became almost impossible to stop. And so you have to be able to put the brakes on at some stage. But there have to be enough people who are aware of the sorts of variations that could come depending on one's understanding of historical narratives in the past. And it's too late to say we never saw it coming, or how did we get here? There's this wonderful passage in Tolstoy's War and Peace. I often refer to it because it's sort of 1.5 pages, and in typical Tolstoy fashion, and in Russian it must be much better than in English, but it's sort of lyrical, and it's just wonderful because Kutuzov finds himself outside of Moscow, and he can't believe how he got there. And he can't remember if there was an order to withdraw. He was the one who had given the order, but he can't remember giving it. And he can't remember abandoning Moscow to Napoleon's forces. He says, how did we get here? And I often think this is where we're going to be in a few years' time, when all the signs of how we are going to get there are with us now. And so one needs a sort of a sense of agency, and small things can often lead to much bigger things, but they have to start. It just requires some sort of determination. I mentioned this earlier. I do worry. People will say to you, the internet has opened before us this vast trove of knowledge. But yes, you need the vast trove, but you have to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. And too much vast knowledge leaves you utterly confused and not seeing the main lines, and not seeing what is truly important from what is just froth. And if we're caught up in the froth, you're not losing sight of what you need to do. And so I think in that, we need to focus on, with absolute clarity, on how we got here and then how to prevent the worst from happening and maintain us on the path of progress generally as human beings, let alone confronting the big transboundary issues and the global issues, climate change and pandemics of the future and so forth.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Anna. I'm also a third-year law student here. And it's really moving how you started your talk with sort of your own reckoning with your family history, and how you talk about how we need to begin with our own communities and with ourselves. So I wonder what you would propose in terms of what that reckoning might look like for people who don't have the same platforms or roles that you've clearly occupied with such integrity. Once you reckon with your own family history, your own community history, like what sort of linked to Shafin, but what then, Or what does that look like?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a prescription for it. The work that the work of human rights activists, and it's not to say that I was one growing up, and I think over the years I became more and more one, but often, people sense if they are that way disposed or not. And the one way that you always identify a human rights person from someone who is not is, imagine a schoolyard when we were children. You don't need to have experienced this to visualize it. And there's a bully pushing around some small kids, usually because the bullies abuse themselves at home or somewhere else. And the humanitarians run after the children that are lying on the floor, pick them up, take them to the infirmary, dust them down. And the human rights people go up to the bully and put the finger on the chest and push them back. And in the context of what one has to do, the hardest challenges for individuals is doing the human rights work in your own community. You know, it's easy to point a finger at the North Koreans and say, you know, terrible what they're doing in North Korea. It's much harder to go into your neighborhood and see prejudice and chauvinism and see misogyny and just let it settle. And if it begs a discussion with family members who have a different view, it's hard because then you're sort of creating distance with your family or your cousins, your aunts and uncles, the people around you. And it becomes very lonely. But you have to decide for yourself whether you need to do this or not. Or do you just sort of say, well, I'll take a pass for most of my life. Well, better to keep my head down, others will do the talking and so forth. So I think there comes a time when you sort of feel that you need to do something. And it's difficult to know at certain stages what you need to do. And Kofi Annan used to say to us, look, you can't be consequential all the time. You know, life has its sort of windows and shutters that open and close, and it might just open at a time when you can be consequential. And then you have to make the right decision. But you can't be it all the time. But it may well come your way if you're in a position like that. And I think that's what one has to think about, that if ever given the opportunity to do something in a local sort of school board or in a local council or in the state legislature or in Congress or wherever you may be, that you're going to be consequential and for the right reasons, I think. So I hope I'll see your name somewhere.
Perhaps one last question. This is California, and the sun addles our brain a little bit, and it sometimes makes us a bit vapid. So your remarks...
Am I being vapid?
No, I am. But I'm going to invite you to be. You know, your remarks point to a very dark kind of series of developments with respect to the failure to take account of memory, division. Based on your work on conflict resolution and human rights, what do you find encouraging about the path ahead?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned it earlier. I think, in an earlier discussion, what I always found totally amazing is when I was leading the office in Geneva, I had a chance to meet with many frontline human rights defenders. And I was always astonished how there were so many ready to give up everything they had, everything material, access to their loved ones, for the sake of standing up to principle. That they would knowingly, like Alexei Navalny did when he went to Russia, yeah. And there are many who are less famous than he is, who would do the same thing. Return to their country, know that the moment they arrive, they're going to be locked up in prison, without any assurance that they're ever going to be released. And they still do it. And you think this is mind-blowing, because our first instinct is self-preservation. That's our most dominant instinct. And to give it up like that is, and you sort of think, well, if they can do something like that, then I can do at least a little bit more than I am doing. And I think they provide us the example. And if everyone were to just devote a little bit of their life in that direction, it would make a difference, I think.
Thank you. Well, as I said in the introduction, we do not award the Ralston Prize very frequently, and it is a truly distinguished collection of recipients. And I think, as you can see from the remarks today, we chose well in bestowing the prize upon Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. So please join me once again in thanking Zeid for his comments.
Thank you.